One of the primary ways we communicate in rehearsal is through conducting gestures that are designed to elicit musical responses. But before we dive into specifics, my colleague Tonu Kalam, director of the UNC Symphony Orchestra, has some interesting thoughts regarding the skills a conductor needs. Tonu, I know you've shared with me how you view conducting kind of three separate categories. I wonder if you can share a little bit about that, and specifically the psychology one.
Yes, I've taught conducting classes at various levels over many years, and through that experience I've distilled for myself a kind of philosophy of what a good conductor or a successful conductor needs to assimilate and know well in order to be successful on the podium. And they are three rather separate and discrete areas, but they all have to have almost an equal role in the conductor's ability to function. Number one is the musical knowledge. The knowledge of repertoire, the knowledge of style, performance practice, history, biography, the conception of a piece, when was it written, why, how do I apply rubato to this composer, what makes French music different from Russian, all those musical questions that any performer deals with, whether you're a pianist or a solo violinist or clarinetist. So the musical mastery, and of course score reading and all of the clefs and transpositions, that's the first area. The second area is the physical, the manual aspect, the technique of conducting. What do we do with our right arm? What do we do with our left arm? How do we subdivide? How do we get out of a fermata? How do we make an accelerando? How do we use our eyes, our faces, anything that has to do with the physical aspects of being on the podium and demonstrating our musical knowledge and ideas to the group. And the third area, which I think in some ways has more importance than has been given or talked about, and is perhaps the hardest to teach, and maybe takes the hardest to learn, is the psychological and interpersonal area, the role of motivation and leadership of the ensemble in front of you. You can be a wonderful musician and know your scores and have great baton technique, but you can be in front of a group and they don't respond because they don't sense a connection with you, they don't sense you're being able to inspire them, they don't sense that the way you're addressing them is respectful of them. When something goes wrong, you start to belittle them or you insult them in front of their colleagues. Very dangerous things to fall into. You have to find ways of, when something does go wrong, how do I make criticism in a constructive rather than a destructive fashion, especially in front of the whole ensemble if one person has played a wrong note or a wrong rhythm. How do you get the players to give their best when you know that they can't play every 16th note perfectly? Can you tell them, why don't you guys lay out for a bar or two or just play the first note of every beat? We'll be fine with that. Don't just yell at them and say, you didn't practice hard enough, you can't play your 16th notes. There are ways of dealing with people's lesser skill development that can still be productive for the ensemble. And I think this whole idea of the psychology of group leadership, group management, of getting them on the same page with you is one that is often neglected in the teaching of conducting because it is hard to teach, and also because it's a very hard thing for some people to grasp. I've seen conductors who are very experienced, 20 or 30 years on the podium, and they still don't treat their players in a way that is going to get the best results. If you treat them well, they will do well for you.
So how do you learn how to do that?
You know, I think it's a question of, partly it's intuition, I think it's awareness, being aware, scanning your group all the time visually, looking at them. How are they reacting? Do they look happy? Do they look sour? Are they talking to their neighbors and are they making fun of something? Is there sort of a negative, disparaging aura in one corner of the room? There are ways I think you can sense that, or the way when you stop and you start to make an instruction verbally, are they all attentive? Or are they starting to gab on their own and you realize they're not really paying attention to me because they've lost respect, they've lost interest, they've lost the continuity. You have to develop a kind of sixth sense about the mood of your group. You have to know your players individually up to a point also, and who's a little bit more sensitive about criticism, and find a way to talk to them, maybe even talk to them in private during a break or after a rehearsal if there's something they're doing that isn't to your liking, rather than singling them out. And trying best not to single out people. I was in a very fortunate learning environment when I studied conducting with one of the great pedagogues, Max Rudolph, who has one of the classic books on conducting. I worked with him for 2 years at Curtis, and we had a small class, and he was very careful in our classes and in our sessions with orchestra to really hardly ever single people out. If somebody was having difficulty with a beat pattern, he would just turn to us and say, you know, none of you has yet developed a clear beat. He would just blanket statement, you all need to work on this, rather than saying your beat isn't clear. And I think that's a very healthy way to go, because it forces us all to still take stock of where we are. It doesn't single people out, and it puts us all on an equal plane, at least in terms of a starting point psychologically. We knew that some people had better beats than others, but he didn't want to put it that way. And I think that was an important thing for me to understand when I was a student in my 20s in his class, that this is a very useful thing to say, you know, and you could say that to a whole wind section and say, you guys, you're not doing very well rhythmically yet. Maybe it's only 1 or 2 people that isn't playing the dotted 8th 16th correctly. But if you tell everybody and make them aware of it, then you know, I think you're going to get a better result from psychological response.
I've often found that if you're talking to about something positive, you can use you say John, you can use their name.
Exactly.
If you're talking about something negative,
exactly.
you say John, it makes more sense to say trumpets.
Yeah,
and make it a little more, so you can say the specific negative, but not put a flag on the fact that you're specific.
And I do single people out positively. Let's say there's a really lovely oboe solo for a section in a piece, and we stop to rehearse something, and I'll say, by the way, the solo was really beautiful. And people will smile and look at the player, or sometimes shuffle their feet, and it raises everybody's level of appreciation for what their colleagues are doing. So that's a very good point. You can single out positive people, but don't single out people for negative criticism.
Let's talk about the shuffling, because there's a little bit of, I think, some misunderstanding. Is that a convention that everyone does? Do you know the origin of that?
I don't know the origin of that. It's a standard orchestral convention, of course, and even happens sometimes at student level, but it's certainly at the professional level. It's shuffling together with things like you tap your bow on the music stand in place of applauding somebody, but I think it's just, I have no idea when that arose and where that came from.
And it's a practical issue, right? If you're holding an instrument,
exactly. You can't clap. So you
still
shuffle your
show
feet, you want to show something, you take your bow and you tap the top of your music stand very gently so you don't damage anything.
Yeah. And it's interesting, just to circle back a little bit to what you said earlier about in terms of knowing your players or performers, you also kind of have to know yourself, because what might work for you to connect with an ensemble may not work for me, depending on my personality. And yet, so we have to kind of experiment and find who we are, what works to connect with us.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point, because I've had many opportunities to guest conduct in different places, and professional orchestras, all-state orchestras, clinics in high schools. And it's very interesting that sometimes you go to a new place and you just click immediately. Within 15 minutes, you feel like they're with me, I'm with them. And with other places, the chemistry doesn't happen even after 4 days. And you feel, okay, they're doing the job, but I don't quite feel that complete, involvement on either side. And I think that's a very hard thing to define as to why that happens, how that happens, what is the collective personality of an ensemble, why do they relate to one person on the podium differently than another, even if they may have similar musical skills or whatever. So, and generally it takes time. I find when I go in front of a new group that I've never conducted before, you have to give yourself at least 30 minutes to acclimate to them, to their reaction to your gestures. They have to acclimate to your gestures, your conducting style, your beat patterns, what you do with the left hand, what you demand of them musically, how well you know your score, and also to see what kind of visual contact you get with the group. You're up there and you're looking who's watching me and who's not, and how attentive are they, how involved are they. There's always that 30 minutes of adjustment, and after that, then you can know this is going to be a great experience or this is going to take a little bit of work.
Basically, this is something that's hard to teach, but it's possible to learn.
Yes, and I think learning by observation is actually a wonderful thing to do. I always tell my conducting students to go watch as many other conductors as you can. I don't care where they're conducting, what they're conducting, whether it's a chorus, or it's a band, or it's a musical with an orchestra in the pit, or an orchestra that's professional. You're always going to learn something, and don't just watch the conductor. Watch the instrumentalists or singers. What is their reaction? How are they playing? Are they with enthusiasm? Are they engaged? Are they not? And you can learn as much from a bad conductor as a good one. You can learn what not to do. You can listen to how a conductor rehearses and saying, man, it's getting a little tedious. He's just sort of taking too much time talking, and you can see the morale droop. So that kind of observation is extremely valuable, both of ensembles and of their leaders.
Great ideas. Thank you.
Thanks.